There are moments in history when the air itself seems to change, when the machinery of power, which has ground millions of lives into dust, suddenly turns and devours one of its own architects. March 1953, Moscow. Joseph Stalin is dead. For 3 days, the Soviet capital holds its breath. Millions weep in the streets, some out of genuine grief, some out of something they cannot yet name. A strange, intoxicating mixture of terror and relief. The man who had shaped their world for nearly 30 years is gone. And now in the corridors of the Kremlin, behind closed mahogany doors and velvet curtains, the men who survived him begin to move. They move carefully, they move quietly, and they move fast. The man who knew everything, Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria, understood power the way a surgeon understands a scalpel, not as something to be admired, but as a tool to be used with precision and without sentiment. Born in 1999 in the village of Marhuli, in what is now Georgia, Beria had risen through the Soviet system with a ruthlessness that even his contemporaries found remarkable. By the time he was appointed head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in 1938, he had already overseen purges, mass deportations, and operations so classified that their full scope would not be known for decades. He was not merely a bureaucrat. He was the institutional memory of Soviet terror. He knew where the bodies were buried, because he had ordered them buried there. And now, in the weeks following Stalin's death, he moved with extraordinary speed to consolidate what he believed was his rightful inheritance. Within days of Stalin's death, Beria had merged the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security into a single monolithic structure under his personal command. He positioned himself as first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union on paper, and arguably the most powerful in practice. He began releasing prisoners. He proposed reforms. He spoke of amnesty, of de-Stalinization, of a new path forward. His colleagues watched him smile, and they were terrified. The coalition of fear. Nikita Khrushchev was not, by any conventional measure, a remarkable man. He was loud where Stalin had been cold, emotional where the system demanded calculation. A peasant son who had clawed his way to the Politburo through sheer survival instinct and a gift for reading rooms full of dangerous men. But Khrushchev understood one thing with crystalline clarity in the spring of 1953. Lavrentiy Beria, if left unchecked, would destroy every single one of them. Not out of ideology, not out of principle, simply because that is what Beria did. That is what Beria had always done. Khrushchev began to talk, quietly, cautiously, in hallways rather than meeting rooms. He spoke to Georgy Malenkov, who was nominally the most powerful man in the country, but who had always been more comfortable with paper than with people. He spoke to Vyacheslav Molotov, who had survived 2 decades of Stalin's inner circle, and who despised Beria with a cold, personal hatred. He spoke to Nikolai Bulganin, to Anastas Mikoyan, to Mikhail Suslov, and then he spoke to Marshal Georgy Zhukov. This was the crucial conversation. Zhukov was not a politician. He was a soldier, arguably the greatest Soviet military commander of the Second World War, a man whose popularity among both the army and the population gave him a kind of legitimacy that the party apparatchiks simply could not match. Beria feared Zhukov, and Zhukov knew it. Zhukov listened to Khrushchev's proposal. He asked several practical questions about timing, about who else was involved, about what would happen afterward. Then he said yes. June 26, 1953. The meeting of the Council of Ministers Presidium was scheduled as routine. There was nothing on the agenda that seemed unusual. The men who gathered in the Kremlin conference room that afternoon had attended dozens of meetings just like it. Beria arrived on time, as he always did. He sat down at the long table, opened his briefcase, and prepared to conduct business. What happened next has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, many of them contradictory, all of them shaped by the political needs of whoever was telling the story. But the outline is clear enough. Khrushchev opened the session. Then, departing entirely from the prepared agenda, he placed a motion before the assembled members, a motion to remove Lavrentiy Beria from all his posts, to relieve him of his duties, and to refer his case to a special commission for investigation. The room went very quiet. Beria looked at Khrushchev. Then he looked around the table, at Malenkov, at Molotov, at Bulganin, at faces he had known for decades, faces he had files on, faces whose owners had reason to fear him, and reasons, he now understood, to act. He started to speak. He may have protested. He may have demanded an explanation. The accounts differ. What is not disputed is what happened next. The doors opened. Marshal Zhukov entered with a group of military officers, not secret police, not NKVD, but Red Army officers, deliberately chosen because their loyalty ran to the military chain of command, not to Beria's apparatus. Zhukov walked to where Beria was sitting and informed him that he was under arrest. For a moment, Lavrentiy Beria, the man who had signed death warrants for hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, the man whose name alone had made people weep with fear, simply stared. Then he was taken from the room. Lefortovo prison in Moscow was not a place designed for comfort. Built in the 18th century, it had served as a military prison, a political detention facility, and for much of the Soviet period, as one of the primary interrogation centers of the secret police. The irony of Beria being held there, in a facility whose operations he had overseen, whose interrogation protocols he had approved, was not lost on those who placed him there. He was housed in a specially prepared cell. He was kept isolated. He was given paper and pen. The investigation that followed lasted 6 months, and it was, by any honest measure, a performance. The conclusions had been reached before the first question was asked. The charges had been written before the first piece of evidence was examined. This was not unusual in the Soviet legal tradition. It was, in fact, the tradition that Beria himself had helped to construct and perfect. The formal indictment against him was extraordinary in its scope. He was accused of high treason against the Soviet state. He was accused of conducting espionage on behalf of foreign powers, specifically Great Britain, a charge that had been a standard feature of Soviet show trials since the 1930s. He was accused of organizing and directing mass repressions against loyal Soviet citizens. He was accused of moral corruption, of abuse of power, of crimes against women, of planning terrorist acts against members of the Soviet leadership. Some of these charges were almost certainly fabricated. Some were almost certainly true. In the Soviet legal system of 1953, the distinction was largely irrelevant. The letters. What is perhaps most striking about the months of Beria's imprisonment, what lends the story something approaching human tragedy, is the letters. He wrote them by hand, on prison stationery, addressing them to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. They were formal in their opening lines, in the way that all official Soviet correspondence was formal. But as they progressed, something else entered the language. He appealed to his service record. He reminded his readers of the atomic bomb program, which he had personally supervised and which had given the Soviet Union nuclear parity with the United States. He pointed to his contributions during the war, to the industrial evacuations he had managed, to the intelligence operations he had run. He pleaded for the opportunity to address the charges in person, to present his case, to speak. He did not, in any of the letters that have survived, ask for mercy in simple terms. That was not the language he knew. He asked instead for the opportunity to be useful, to continue to serve, to be given a role, any role, that would allow him to demonstrate his loyalty. The letters were received, they were filed, they were never answered. In the margins of at least one of them, a handwritten note, attribution uncertain, possibly Khrushchev, possibly Malenkov, contains a single word. No, the architecture of inevitability. By late autumn of 1953, the investigation had produced its materials. Hundreds of pages of testimony from subordinates who had worked under Beria and who now, with considerable, understandable motivation, provided whatever the investigators required. From witnesses who recalled conversations, orders, decisions, from documents selectively extracted from the vast archives of the security apparatus. The legal team assigned to prosecute the case was led by Roman Rudenko, the Procurator General of the Soviet Union, a man who had represented the USSR at the Nuremberg trials and who understood, with professional thoroughness, how to construct a case whose conclusion was already determined. The trial was set for December. Sitting in his cell in Lefortovo, Beria continued to write. He had perhaps by this point begun to understand something that the men he had sent to the same cells had understood before him, that the machine does not negotiate, that the process does not bend, that the outcome had been decided not in any courtroom, but in the Kremlin conference room on the afternoon of June 26th. He had built this machine. He had fed it. He had maintained it. And now, with a precision he would have professionally admired in any other context, it was coming for him. Outside the prison walls, Moscow moved into winter, the streets filled with snow. Citizens went about their lives, working, waiting, surviving, as Soviet citizens had always survived, with the particular resilience of people who had learned not to ask too many questions about what happened to powerful men who disappeared. No one spoke of Beria in public. His name had already begun its disappearance from the official record. Photographs were being retouched. References were being removed. The encyclopedia entry that had praised him so effusively would need to be replaced with something else, with a condemnation written in the same measured, authoritative prose. The Soviet Union was already practicing the art of forgetting. And in Lefortovo, the man who had helped teach it that art waited for a trial whose verdict had already been written. The final letter Beria sent to the Central Committee was dated December 19th, 1953. The trial began on December 18th. He did not know that when he wrote it. Or perhaps he did. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in rooms where the outcome has already been decided. It is not the silence of uncertainty. It is not the silence of deliberation. It is something denser than that. The silence of a ceremony whose script has been written, rehearsed, and approved, and where every participant understands their role with perfect clarity. The courtroom in the building of the Ministry of Defense on Arbatskaya Square in Moscow held that silence on the morning of December 18th, 1953. Outside, the city was deep in winter. Snow had been falling since the previous night, laying itself across the rooftops and boulevards with the patient indifference that Moscow winter always carries. Citizens walked to work, to markets, to schools. Trams moved along their routes. The ordinary machinery of life continued turning as it always did, regardless of what was happening behind closed doors in official buildings, because the doors were very firmly closed. The architecture of a closed process. No journalists were present. No public gallery was permitted. No independent observers attended. The proceedings of the special judicial presence of the Supreme Court of the USSR, the body convened specifically and exclusively to try Lavrentiy Beria, were classified in their entirety. The Soviet public would learn of the verdict only after it had been delivered, in a brief official announcement that told them everything the state wished them to know and nothing more. The tribunal itself was composed of 10 men. To call them judges in any conventional sense would stretch the definition considerably. They were rather a carefully assembled collection of the Soviet Union's most senior figures, men whose authority derived not from legal training or judicial independence, but from their positions at the apex of the party and state apparatus. Marshal Ivan Konev, one of the legendary commanders of the Second World War, served on the panel. So did representatives from the major Soviet republics, from the trade union apparatus, from the party leadership. The chairman was Roman Rudenko, the Procurator General, the same man who had led the prosecution at Nuremberg, a figure of considerable professional skill and absolutely no ambiguity about what was required of him here. Rudenko had built the case file over 6 months. It ran to thousands of pages. It contained testimony from dozens of witnesses, former subordinates, former colleagues, individuals who had worked within the security apparatus under Beria's command. It contained documentary evidence selectively drawn from the archives. It contained, in its precise legal architecture, everything necessary to support charges that had been determined before a single page was written: high treason, espionage, organization of mass repressions, abuse of official position, crimes against the Soviet state and its citizens. The indictment was, in one sense, a masterpiece of Soviet legal construction. In another sense, the sense that any independent legal observer would immediately recognize, it was a political document dressed in judicial clothing. The man who sat across the room. Lavrentiy Beria had spent 6 months in Lefortovo preparing for this moment. He had read the charges, he had written responses. He had, in the particular manner of a man who had spent his entire professional life within systems of power, attempted to find the lever, the argument, the formulation that might shift the balance even fractionally in his direction. He understood, with the clarity that only his specific professional background could provide, exactly what kind of process he was facing. He had overseen processes precisely like this one. He had approved the frameworks, signed the orders, reviewed the protocols. He knew better than almost anyone alive what a predetermined Soviet judicial proceeding looked like from the inside. And yet, there is something in human nature that resists the final acknowledgement of its own powerlessness. Even the most clear-eyed analyst, confronting their own destruction, searches for the exception, for the argument that will prove different, for the possibility that this time, uniquely, impossibly, the machinery will pause. When Beria was brought into the courtroom, he carried himself with something that observers later described variously as composure, as defiance, and as the slightly unreal calm of a man who had not yet fully arrived at the place his mind was taking him. He was 64 years old. He wore civilian clothes, not a uniform, a deliberate choice by those managing the proceedings, stripping him visually of the authority his ranks had conveyed. His famous pince-nez glasses sat on his nose as they always had. He sat down at the defendant's table and looked at the men arrayed before him. Men he had known for decades, men he had worked alongside, men whose files he had read and in some cases written. None of them looked back with anything he might have recognized as warmth. What he said. The proceedings lasted less than a single day. In any functioning judicial system, a case of this complexity, spanning decades, involving hundreds of alleged victims, touching on the highest levels of state power, would require months of careful examination. Witnesses would be called and cross-examined. Evidence would be scrutinized. Defense counsel would have meaningful opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. None of that occurred here. Beria's defense counsel was present. The Soviet system maintained the formal appearance of legal representation even in its most theatrical proceedings, but the counsel's role was largely ceremonial. There was no challenge to the admissibility of evidence. There was no serious cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses because no witnesses were actually called to testify in person. The evidence was presented in documentary form, read into the record, accepted without meaningful contest. What Beria himself said is a matter of some historical interest, because his statements represent the only authentic voice in a proceeding that was otherwise entirely scripted. He denied the charge of treason, categorically, directly, and, according to those present, with something that sounded like genuine conviction. He was not, he said, a traitor to the Soviet state. He had served the Soviet state for his entire adult life. He had given it his capabilities, his years, his considerable organizational talents. He did not deny participating in repressions. He could not. The documentary evidence was too extensive, too specific, too thoroughly drawn from records he himself had created. What he argued instead was context, that he had acted under orders, that the decisions had come from above, that the machinery he had operated had been directed by Stalin, and that he, like every other official who had survived the Stalin years, had implemented policies he had not always designed. This argument was legally and politically irrelevant within the framework of the proceedings, and Beria was experienced enough to know it. But he made it anyway, perhaps because it was true, perhaps because he had no other ground to stand on, perhaps because even in that room facing those men, something in him needed to say it. He did not, by any account that has survived, break down. He did not plead for mercy in the hearing itself, though the formal petition for clemency would come afterward. He conducted himself with the particular self-possession of a man who understood that he was performing a role in a drama whose conclusion was written, and who had decided that whatever else might be taken from him, his bearing in this room would remain his own. The verdict. The deliberations of the tribunal were brief. How brief exactly is not known. The records remain classified or destroyed, but the process from the close of arguments to the delivery of the verdict was measured in hours rather than days. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, execution by shooting. The same sentence was simultaneously pronounced on 6 of Beria's closest associates. Vsevolod Merkulov, who had headed the NKGB, Vladimir Dekhanozov, former deputy foreign minister and head of Georgian security. Pavel Meshik, who had overseen Ukrainian security operations. Lev Vlodzimirsky, who had led investigative operations, and 2 others whose careers had been intertwined with Beria's across decades of Soviet security work. 7 men, 7 verdicts, delivered in a single day in a classified proceeding by a panel of 10 senior Soviet officials who had been appointed to this specific task by the political leadership that had also decided the outcome. The petition that was never read Soviet legal procedure of the period provided for a right of petition, a formal request for clemency that could be submitted to the Presidium of the Central Committee following sentencing. It was, in most cases, a formality. The petition was prepared, submitted, and either granted or declined based on political considerations that had nothing to do with its legal content. Beria submitted his petition. It was written in his own hand, on the paper he was provided in his cell, in the careful official language of Soviet formal correspondence that he had used his entire career. The specific contents of this petition have not been fully released to historians, but fragments and summaries that have emerged from partial archival access suggest that he returned one final time to the same arguments he had made throughout: his service, his contributions, the context of his actions, his willingness to accept any punishment short of death. The Presidium met. The petition was placed before them. The record suggests that the discussion was short. The petition was denied. What the trial tells us. Historians looking back at the Beria trial across the decades since 1953 have reached remarkably consistent conclusions, regardless of their national background, political orientation, or methodological approach. The trial was not, in any meaningful sense, a judicial proceeding. It was a political act conducted in judicial form, the Soviet system's method of transforming a power struggle into a legal verdict, of converting a political decision into an institutional fact. This does not mean that Beria was innocent of the crimes attributed to him. The historical record of his involvement in mass repressions, in the operations of the terror apparatus, in decisions that cost hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens their lives and their freedom. That record is extensive, documented, and not seriously disputed by serious historians. Whatever the procedural failures of his trial, the man who sat in that courtroom had done things that deserved accounting. What the trial failed to provide was not justice for Beria. It was justice as a concept, as a process, as a method, as a standard against which power holds itself accountable. The Soviet system, in trying Beria the way it did, demonstrated with unintentional clarity the very thing that made it dangerous. That within it, guilt or innocence was always secondary to political necessity. The same framework that had been used to destroy innocent people, the closed proceeding, the predetermined verdict, the documentary evidence assembled to support a conclusion rather than to discover one, was used here against a man who, by most historical assessments, had genuine crimes to answer for. The machinery did not distinguish. It never had. That was, in a profound and terrible way, exactly the point. Educational value. What this chapter of history teaches. The trial of Lavrentiy Beria occupies a specific and important place in the broader history of political justice, not merely Soviet history, but the universal history of how states handle the transition of power and the accountability of those who exercised it. Several lessons emerge with particular clarity. The limits of revolutionary justice. When political systems collapse or transform, there is always pressure to hold the previous era's enforcers accountable. The Beria trial represents one model of how that accountability can be pursued, and its failures illustrate why that model is inadequate. Justice that is indistinguishable from revenge, conducted through processes that mirror the abuses being prosecuted, produces historical conclusions that remain permanently contested. The institutional memory of repression. Beria's case demonstrates how deeply the mechanisms of terror become embedded in state institutions. The same tools, the closed trial, the classified record, the politically appointed tribunal, that the Soviet state had used against ordinary citizens, were the only tools available when it turned against its own leadership. Institutions shape the options available to those who inherit them. The difference between guilt and accountability. One of the lasting complexities of the Beria case is that a man who bore genuine, documented, serious responsibility for enormous suffering was tried in a manner that made it impossible to establish that responsibility through any process that history could fully credit. This is not merely an academic concern. It is one of the central challenges facing transitional justice in societies emerging from authoritarian periods, a challenge that has confronted Germany after 1945, Eastern Europe after 1989, and numerous other societies across the 20th and 21st centuries, the political weaponization of law. Perhaps the most durable lesson of the Beria trial is the clearest and the most uncomfortable. Legal systems that are subordinate to political power cannot provide justice even when the person they are processing is genuinely culpable. The form of justice and the substance of justice are not the same thing, and conflating them, as the Soviet system systematically did, ultimately corrodes the legitimacy of both. The snow continued to fall on Moscow in December of 1953. The trial concluded. The verdict was announced in a brief official statement. The city absorbed the information and continued moving. And in Lefortovo, Lavrentiy Beria returned to his cell and began to write one final time. The night of December 23rd was coming. There is a question that history asks about certain moments, not what happened, but what was said. Not the documented fact, but the final human utterance, the closing sentence of a life. We ask this question not because the words change anything. The outcome was settled. The machinery had completed its work. We ask it because last words are where history and mythology converge. And in the case of Lavrentiy Beria, that question has haunted the historical record for more than 7 decades. The night of December the 23rd, a group of security personnel under the command of an officer named Shelestenko was assembled in Lefortovo on the night of December 23rd, 1953. The location was a prepared room in the basement, approximately 12 square meters, with the functional austerity of spaces designed for official purposes that no one discusses openly. The 6 associates convicted alongside Beria were processed first. Beria was last. The deliberate sequencing, placing him at the very end, may have been practical, or it may have been meaningful. In Soviet institutional culture, the ordering of things was rarely entirely accidental. It was approximately 10:30 in the evening. 1 word, 7 decades. The account that has achieved the widest circulation holds that Beria, in his final moments, said a single word. Not a sentence, not a declaration. One name, Zhukov. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had walked through the door of the Kremlin conference room on June 26th. The man who had personally placed Beria under arrest. His name, spoken as the last word Beria would ever say. It is a remarkable story. It carries the quality of literature, the perfect circularity of it, the arrested man naming his arrestor at the very moment of his final disappearance. Almost too clean, too resonant, too precisely meaningful to be accidental, which is exactly why historians have never been able to accept it as established fact. 4 interpretations of a single name. The historical literature has produced 4 distinct readings of what that word, if spoken, might have meant. The first reads it as an appeal, that even in those final seconds, some part of Beria was calling out for intervention, that the name was spoken the way a drowning person calls, not rationally, not strategically, but from the pure biological insistence on survival that overrides all calculation. Zhukov was not there. There was no intervention coming. The word was futile, and that futility is what makes it heartbreaking. The second reads it as accusation. That Beria, stripped of everything, chose to name the specific man he held responsible, not Khrushchev, not the tribunal, but the soldier who had put hands on him. A final act of defiance compressed into a proper noun. In this reading, Beria did not submit. He assigned blame. The third reads it as a question. Why Zhukov specifically? Why had the one man whose loyalty ran to the army, rather than to any political faction, chosen to align himself with Khrushchev? In this reading, the word expresses genuine bewilderment, the confusion of a man who had spent his career mapping the motivations of powerful people, and found at the very end one motivation he could not fully decode. The fourth is the most poignant. In this reading, Zhukov was the last hope, not an address, not an accusation, not a question, but the name Beria associated with the last moment the trajectory might have bent differently. The mind, at its absolute limit, reaching not for abstractions or ideology, but for a specific human face. The problem with the sources. Here is what the documentary record actually establishes. Nothing. There are no contemporary written records of Beria's final words. No court documents, no verified execution reports, no contemporaneous testimony from those present that has been released through proper archival channels. Every single account, everyone, is a secondary source. Memoirs written years or decades after the event. Journalistic reconstructions based on interviews with people who claim knowledge. The earliest accounts researchers have dated with confidence emerged in the 1970s, nearly 20 years after the night in question. This does not mean the last word did not happen. Absence of documentation in a Soviet security context is not the same as absence of occurrence. What it does mean is that the story lives in the space between history and legend, neither fully confirmed nor fully refuted, but symbolically powerful in a way that mere facts sometimes fail to achieve. Why the legend survives. The story has persisted for 7 decades because it is symbolically true, even if it is factually unverifiable. Beria spent his career as the man who knew other people's secrets, the architect of a system that reduced human beings to files, extracted confessions, and processed individuals through machinery that did not ask for their consent. He understood power as the capacity to make other people's stories end. And then, in a basement room in Lefortovo on a December night, his own story ended. The legend says he spent his last breath on a name. Not a principle, not a declaration of innocence, not a final accounting of his contributions to the Soviet state. A name, a person, the specific human being who had been the proximate agent of his fall. If true, this tells us something about the irreducible humanity that persists even in people who have done terrible things. The way that, at the extreme limit, we return to the personal rather than the abstract. The file keeper becomes a person again, thinking about one specific other person. If not true, if the legend was constructed rather than recorded, then it tells us what we need to believe about such moments. That power, however absolute, however sustained across decades, must eventually confront something it cannot manage. Either way, the legend says something true. Educational value. What this chapter of history teaches us. The epistemology of historical evidence. The Beria case offers an unusually clear illustration of the difference between what occurred and what can be established. The lesson for anyone engaging seriously with history is that absence of a record does not mean absence of an event, and the presence of a compelling story does not mean the presence of a verified fact. Both forms of skepticism are necessary simultaneously. How political systems process their own. Beria did things that deserved accounting. He was tried in a manner that made genuine accounting impossible. This tension between a person's real history and the political use made of prosecuting them appears in transitional justice processes around the world. Whenever societies attempt to hold powerful people accountable through systems that remain entangled with the same power structures they are trying to judge. The persistence of mythology in historical consciousness. The story of the last word has survived because human beings need narrative to process historical events. Certain form, the circular, the ironic, the humanizing, carry symbolic weight that purely documentary history cannot match. The question is not whether to tell stories, but whether to tell them honestly, acknowledging clearly where the document ends and the legend begins. The relationship between individual agency and systemic power. Beria built the machine. Beria was destroyed by the machine. The arc of his story illustrates, with unusual clarity, how systems of unchecked authority ultimately consume even those who design them. The lesson is structural. It is not primarily about Beria as an individual, but about what happens when institutions are built without the transparency and accountability that allow them to serve rather than devour. The archives that contain whatever records exist of those final hours remain partially closed. The question, what was the last word, remains open. Perhaps it always will. Perhaps that is exactly where it belongs.